Hello and welcome to the Bush Summit for 2023. The Bush Summit is an annual event designed to bring together interested parties to discuss the challenges across regional Australia and the unique opportunities in the country as well. This year it was held in 6 different locations across Australia, and over the next hour we're going to be bringing you all the highlights across each of those events, beginning right here in beautiful Tamworth, New South Wales, where the event was opened by the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, in an opening address.
Well, thanks very much, Ben. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. It is such a pleasure to be back in Tamworth. When it comes to bringing Australians together, this city has done some heavy lifting. For more than a half century now, you've been bringing Australians together right here at this venue from all over the continent. The Bush Summit is a rock-solid part of my diary. I've been to every single one. As I said at the first one, held in Dubbo in 2019, bringing people together is such an important step because it is only together that we can rise to meet the challenges facing us. When we gathered in Dubbo that year, we were in the middle of the worst drought in living memory. Then began the first fires of what would become the long black summer. The smoke had barely cleared when COVID hit. Then the floods came. Now we look ahead with some apprehension to what the coming summer will bring. During the floods, I saw devastation that will stay with me for the rest of my life. I heard stories of courage, stories of loss and heartbreak, homes gone, businesses painstakingly built on dreams and hard work, left in ruins. But there were also extraordinary, uplifting stories of resilience and extraordinary strength. Few things give you a sense of perspective, quite like being in the presence of someone who has tragically lost everything, but who is not only determined to stay standing, they're making sure their neighbour does as well. In the coming months, my government, through the National Emergency Management Agency, will work with states and territories to deliver a suite of preparedness activities to support communities for the upcoming higher risk weather season. We have engaged with stakeholders and will continue to do so to ensure that farmers and rural communities are equipped with the necessary tools and knowledge to effectively handle the heightened risk of drought. I'm pleased today to announce an additional $38 million in funding to support the long-term trial of new and emerging agriculture practices to build drought resilience in a changing climate. This program is part of the Future Drought Fund, which provides funds to strengthen drought resilience across our agriculture landscape and throughout regional communities. During the terrible months of the Black Summer, Australians did what they always do. They responded to the worst of times by showing their very best of their character. Even the smallest communities in the bush showed such gigantic spirit, with friends and strangers alike looking out for each other, often putting their own safety on the line for those around them. Courage and leadership like that is a reminder every government has a duty to measure up to the qualities of the people we have the great privilege of representing. And one of those qualities is looking ahead and planning for the future. We're reducing the need for so many of us to be concentrated in a handful of big cities, particularly on the East Coast. As new possibilities open up, some of the ways of working that we have for so long taken for granted will start to look a little bit retro. We're investing in rewiring the nation to bring our energy transmission into the 21st century, underpinning the reliability of electricity across Australia, making sure every part of the country has the power they need when they need it. Ultimately, this will reduce power bills, taking pressure off families and business owners alike. It will help Australian manufacturing, so much of which takes place in our regional cities and towns. More Australians will be able to take advantage of the lifestyle that regional Australia makes possible, and in turn they'll add to the strength of the communities that they become a part of. Of course, it's not just universities. It's also TAFE, and our 180,000 fee-free TAFE places we're delivering this year are making an enormous difference in overcoming skills shortages, whilst also putting downward pressure on inflation. Risk reduction and resilience isn't just about infrastructure. Roads that don't get washed away are vital. Communication systems that can work across state borders and through bushfire smoke are essential. But the most critical ingredient in recovery and resilience is our human relationships.
You would have seen, or you may have seen, some of the protests outside. Certainly, I've been here for a day or so, and with our coverage over the last 2 weeks, and also with the research that we've commissioned, the surveys, one thing that's come up in the last 12 months that really wasn't on the radar before is sort of anger and concern in the bush about how our transition to renewables is being rolled out in the bush, and the sense that perhaps the bush is perhaps shouldering the burden more than it should, more than its fair share.
Yeah. Look, the former government in New South Wales declared New England to be one of the renewable energy zones. That's something that my government supports, and we worked closely with the former Perrottet government, as well as we'll work with the Minns government. I think the announcement yesterday is a really positive one. Clearly, there needs by the agency. Clearly, there needs to be much better community engagement and consultation than there has been in the past. It's always better if you bring communities with you.
I think the government's got us at the moment on a pathway to disruption of energy supply, and far from a $275 reduction in electricity prices, people are now getting double-digit increases in their electricity and gas bills on a quarterly basis. I don't think it's sustainable, and I think it's why we need to have an honest discussion, and I am against the creation of havoc and pain within rural communities. I think Australians need to be treated equally, and rolling out 28,000 kilometres of poles and wires, as the government is proposing, is not only incredibly expensive, it's not the most efficient way of spending taxpayers' money.
We've got to get the energy transition done right, and I acknowledge that there's a real community concern about it traversing, particularly the transmission lines across primary agricultural land. I'm looking at the costs as well. I mean, some estimates suggest that it'll be 3 times more expensive to underground it or earth it as opposed to put it in the air. And the significant costs associated with the transition have to be part of our discussion on renewable energy as well. I mean, we can't have a situation where we're all focused on renewable energy and decreasing our carbon footprint, but the prices skyrocket as a result. So it's a real paradox. I don't have an easy answer to it, Joe. It's part of the reason why we've had a regional inquiry that's looking really closely at it. And I just want to be honest about that. If I had a solution, I'd present it here today because I know it's causing anxiety amongst regional communities.
Why is The Voice getting so much attention when we have so many critical issues that need attention right now?
It's simply an advisory body to enable us to listen to Indigenous Australians about matters that affect them in order to get better results. If we do the same thing, we should expect the same outcomes. And we currently have 4 out of 19 closing the gap targets are being met. All of these stats on health, education, housing, incarceration rates show we need to do something different.
We could talk about The Voice for a long time.
Not everybody at Uluru, and I was at Uluru. I don't think a voice to Parliament is going to fix all those problems. We want you to be able to sit down with us.
I respect the view that you've put forward, and there is no question that not every Indigenous person has the same position. A body that's elected by Indigenous people, of Indigenous people, to make representations of Indigenous people to government, then in my view, my strong view, I agree with the request by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people overwhelmingly, that will be a step forward in the path towards reconciliation.
I'd really like to know how you see it, what your role is in opposition advocating for the bush and for the regions.
The opportunity for us is to really reimagine some of the policies, first point, obviously to hold the government to account. I think we're doing that in relation to a number of issues around cost of living and the voice, etc. at the moment. But the true time in opposition is to re-engage with Australians, with stakeholders. When you're a minister, as Defence Minister, you're racing from one issue to the next and dealing with the departmental requirements and visiting bases and making decisions, negotiating AUKUS, all of that. When you get into opposition...
Just casually negotiating AUKUS.
That's right. But when you get into opposition, you have time again to be able to have a longer conversation, and I think that's the benefit of being here today, but the more general engagement that we have across portfolios and across the country. But I think a lot of astute operators are now diversifying elsewhere, and not just Australian companies, but companies from our region, from North America, from Europe, elsewhere, are looking at ways in which they can de-risk, because as Australia's ambassador to the United States, Kevin Rudd, pointed out in the last 24 hours, we live in a very difficult time.
An issue we've heard a lot about so far, and will continue, I think, at this Bush Summit to hear about, is livability in the bush, particularly pressures on housing. And if I could join that perhaps with, obviously, the need to get labour and a workforce into our regions, which further puts pressure on housing. What's going wrong, and what are you focusing on in terms of how to maybe come up with solutions for this very difficult problem?
Well, it's a good question, Claire. I mean, clearly there are supply-side issues. In government, we provided a lot of support to first home buyers. We provide access to superannuation for young first home buyers so that they could get the deposit that was needed to actually enter the housing market. Now, all of those measures have fuelled demand, and at the same time, the government's announcing that they're going to bring in, through the migration program, about 1.5 million people over the course of the next 5 years or so. That's a population bigger than the city of Adelaide, and at the moment we've got Australians lined up in queues to try and rent a property. People can't buy a house at auction for love nor money, and I think if you're fuelling the demand, as the government is through the migration program, then that's going to put more pressure on housing stock here. So migration is a good thing for our country, particularly where in regional areas people can't find the labour for abattoirs or for agricultural production and harvesting, etc. So we need to be realistic about our needs.
Very strong on this. I think you've identified 3,000 public land holdings that could be released potentially for housing. And I think a lot of people, especially in the cities, can't quite get their head around how there can be a housing crisis or a housing shortage in the bush. We think, oh, there's wide open spaces everywhere. How is it that I suppose housing growth has stagnated so much in regional New South Wales? And what can your government do to fast track it so that when these big projects come along, we've got literally the roofs over the heads of the people we need to work there?
Look, a couple of things. Firstly, we have a massive housing shortage. We've got very low unemployment. We've got enormous amounts of private capital willing to invest in the housing market, and yet we keep getting it so wrong. Now, these are some statistics that have recently come to our attention. The Productivity Commission said that New South Wales produces 6 houses per 1,000 people every 12 months. 6 per 1,000 every 12 months. In Victoria, they produce 8 for 1,000 people, and in Queensland, 9. Now, let's put this in perspective. New South Wales has the biggest population. We've had the biggest increase in housing costs. We've had the biggest increase in rents. We're going to have the largest number of inbound immigrants, and yet we're coming last on the eastern seaboard when it comes to housing completions. I think the reason for that is that there's too much bureaucracy clogging down building approvals. We've got the private capital. We have the demand. We know that because housing prices are going through the roof. And I think probably because of the Greens and some of their rhetoric, we've gotten into this circular argument around a rental cap being the answer to regional and metropolitan housing crisis, when it's not.
There are quite a few along these lines. I suspect they come from a few people out the front. But Sean says, what can the government do to address the nationwide teacher shortage that is particularly dire in rural and regional areas? And obviously that's been supplemented by a lot of questions about the pay claim and why the government isn't paying teachers more, giving them a greater increase.
First instance, we've committed to converting 16,000 teacher and admin roles to permanent positions in New South Wales. And most of them, more than 50% of them, will be in the regions. And that's an important initiative because it doesn't cost the Treasury any more money, but it says to teachers, we want you to stay in our community. Here's a permanent job so you can plan your life around it. More often than not, regional teachers are saying, if I'm on a temporary job, or a temporary contract, even though my boss says I'm going to be needed next year, it's impossible for me to get financing for a loan or a mortgage to stay in that community. So those permanent positions are rolling out. As I said in the speech, we've offered and have offers accepted of over 10,000 in just the last 3.5 months. They're continuing to roll out. And I think that's an important way of establishing to teachers in particular that we want you, we need you, you're part of our plans for the future.
Western Australia is booming thanks to the resources sector, and with an abundance of critical minerals and rare earths still in the ground, the outlook is bright. At WA's Bush Summit, we hear from some of the key players, including the Resources Minister Madeleine King and Australia's richest person, Gina Rinehart, about the opportunities and challenges facing the sector that powers the nation's economy.
Our engagement with and our appreciation of the bush, I believe, has diminished. Over 86% of us now live in big capital cities. Most of Australia's job and economic opportunities have gravitated to the suburbs and inner cities, in contrast to decades past. This has not only depleted the bush of its young people, but set many small towns on a slow path to decline. It has also led to losing sight of what the bush represents and the central role it plays in Australia's future. It has, I think, led to many Australians in urban areas losing sight of where much of the nation's prosperity comes from, where the food and energy comes from, and we need to change this. Fortunately, we're now seeing a reset in favour of the regions. People are continuing to flock to the bush, drawn to its amenity, its livability, its comparatively affordable housing, and in Western Australia by good jobs with big salaries and bright futures. Growing a stronger, more successful nation doesn't begin and end at our cities. It also means supporting our regions and regional towns to be strong, vibrant and economically diversified. As Minister for Resources and Northern Australia, I'm committing to unlocking the bush's full potential and furthering the multi-generational effort of developing the regions to our north, many of which suffer from the twin tyrannies of distance and disadvantage. Australians in rural and remote areas have a right to the same basic services on offer as those of us that live in the cities. Investing in Northern Australia's economy will boost migration to these areas. It will enable the provision of services and economic opportunities for country people that some in the city take for granted. I look forward to working with our state and territory partners to deliver projects and initiatives that grow our regions further, and which lead to strong interrelationships between all the regions and all of our great cities. Thank you so very much.
So can I just ask you, for how long do you think Australia will be an exporter of gas? And how do you see gas? Is it a fossil fuel on the way out, or is it an indispensable and invaluable transition fuel?
There is a need for gas in this state to power the minerals processing we'll need to have the technologies to decarbonise. Gas will be a part of the future, but it will also be part of a decarbonised future, because that's what the gas companies are committed to and what this government is committed to. And to be honest, I think we're all actually on the same page. There are just disagreements on how we get there. And I don't mean between government and gas cos, I mean between some activists around the corner, around the way. But the thing is, we do want to get to net zero. Gas will be part of that story.
Isn't it fantastic to be able to welcome Bush Summit to West Australia, the first time that the summit has come to this faraway but productive land? Well, for years iron ore was the single biggest contributor to Australia's revenue. But now we are number 2 to that popular, perhaps in Treasury circles, King Coal. And now let's try to put some smiles on your faces. I've been thinking what would be great outcomes to achieve for this first West Australian Bush Summit. A list for your thoughts. 1. Commitment to change Section 89 of the WA Land Administration Act to remove the ban so that those in agriculture can pay up to the limit of, say, $2 million, depending on sliding scale of property value, and opt for freehold. May be quite useful for if or when a National Heritage Act appears. 2. Commitment from the faraway feds to get rid of the limit on work hours so that veterans, pensioners and uni students can work without onerous paperwork burdens, and with the consequence, expensive taxpayer-paid bureaucracy is lessened. If we could cut some of the paperwork and the regulations here, we would find a lot of Aussies who would actually like to work, very much like to work as well. They're just restricted by government. 3, commitment to see more of the monies earned in the bush actually return to the bush. 4, commitment that given agriculture usually doesn't have the financial resources that the mining industry has, and this is a big thing I think we are overlooking. It just doesn't have the resources unless, of course, you've got a mining company in your back pocket. But you've actually got to add up the expense of these net zero policies on farmers. Just look at requiring electric vehicles alone, be they for lawnmowers, motorbikes, utes, four-wheel drives, tractors, harvesters, trucks, bulldozers, graders, front-end loaders and or more. It's going to cost a fortune that farmers and pastoralists don't have without a mining company in the back pocket. Number 5. This has been touched upon, I think. Please cast your eyes to the screens, which show federal and West Australian government tape that requires, in our view, cutting. My first preference is immediate termination of all of the listed and or sunset laws, such that after 4 years, all government tape automatically goes, and bureaucrats in each relevant department must sign their names and provide reasons as to why the tape should be reinstated. And if more than, say, 75% of that department recommend reinstatement, then those views are published, a suitable committee is formed to review and decide. Number 6, commitment from state and federal to bring in those and-if policies. This has again been touched on, I heard briefly in the panel. Initially for the north above the 26th parallel, then spreading to other bush areas. ANDIV, which stands for Australians for Northern Development and Economic Vision, is an organisation of unpaid volunteers, which I started many years ago, a bit over a decade, that promotes special economic zones be established, like the many thousands that operate successfully around the world, but not in Australia. Successful because they cut both government tape and tax. There are now more than 8,000 of these zones operating successfully around the world. Together, let's lead the way to drive such very beneficial economic zones. Growing up on stations, the family unit is close and trusting, as ours certainly was. Even in the last few days, ignoring the tight bond this West Australian family had for decades, instead just referring to some correspondence when I was very concerned about our family company over a few years. Sadly, rightly so. Most farmers and others in agriculture, be it the orchardists and others, cannot afford net zero. They will have to leave agriculture. With the consequences, Aussies in the towns will see huge food price increases and fresh food shortages. Let's not upset many farmers with bird-killing wind generators and massive solar panel stretches, and bring on clean, safe nuclear energy. Please, Australia.
For SA, the Bush Summit lands in Port Lincoln, the seafood capital of Australia. The state's regions have been hard hit by Chinese sanctions on wine and lobster, but new opportunities in mining copper could help diversify regional SA's sources of revenue. But to expand requires housing. A lack of regional homes has been identified as one of the biggest constraints to growth. Here's more from Port Lincoln.
I've spent time filming in the mines up around Whyalla and up at Olympic Dam and all those sorts of places. And I just reckon until you see it, city people don't kind of get the enormity it has on our state.
Yeah, so I think if you went to, I'm paraphrasing here or going by gut feel, but if you went to many people in the city and said, what's the centre of mining, the first thing they probably think of is Western Australia. The truth is, Cozzy, South Australia hasn't been blessed with the huge volume of natural resources below the ground as many other parts of the country. Now, that's not to say that we haven't had it, and that's not to say it shouldn't be appreciated. So much of our state story does derive from the Copper Coast, parts of the Iron Triangle in different form. Of course, we've been blessed with some natural gas in the northern part of our state, which has been central to and still is central today to our electricity supply. The second half of this century, South Australia does have the potential for its moment in the sun. And copper will be central to that. Critical minerals will be central to that. Lithium, for instance, amongst others. And we do have those resources here. We have the world's second best copper resource, and we don't even know the full extent of it. So this is something to be very, very excited about, but getting it out of the ground and beneficiating it here in South Australia is complex. It requires big economic investment, and that's what the Northern Water Project is all about. Can I do it? I want to just take a bit of a risk here. Who here, I know that we've got regional communities throughout the state represented here. Who here has heard of the Northern Water Project before I started rambling about it? Okay, well that's really positive.
It's well over half, yep.
Yeah, that's excellent. This has the power to unlock extraordinary wealth, new wealth for our state. The royalty uplift for government alone could potentially be worth billions upon billions of dollars. But this is an important one, and I hope you don't mind me saying this here, Cozzy. It's important that regional South Australia, particularly this part of the state, pay attention to this project. If you're not interested in this project for the future of other generations, then pretty much no one else will.
We are going to hear from some younger voices of our state. I'm about to be joined by 3 students who are part of the Advertiser Teen Parliament Legend Group. The Advertiser launched its annual Teen Parliament back in 2022, and this actually gives senior school students from around the state a major platform to pitch their big idea to grow South Australia. Each of these guys basically went to Parliament House and put forward your ideas, and chatting to you guys before, a very diverse range of topics as well. So we might go along. Should we start with Sep? Tell us what you took to Parliament and why you're so passionate about it.
Sure. So the idea that I presented to Parliament was nuclear energy for South Australia. The point that I gave was that with the housing crisis that we're all going through and the huge electricity bills that we have to pay for, nuclear energy can be the solution to reducing electricity costs. With uranium that Australia produces, we produce 1/3 of the world's uranium supply, and 3 of the largest uranium exports come from South Australia itself. So I found that really interesting when I found it out, and thought that it'd be a great point to bring up. Yeah.
So you would like to build a nuclear power plant here on Eyre Peninsula, and what would you say to people that said, nah, you can't do that, shouldn't do that?
Look, to be totally honest, I'd be happy to have a solid vitrified nuclear waste storage facility in my backyard. The radiation exposed from storage facilities like that, like the one proposed in Kimber, are much less than people think. going through airport security, like most of you will be today or in the coming days going back to Adelaide, you'll undergo more radiation than you would standing next to solid vitrified nuclear waste. A lot less than workers that are there year-round would experience.
If you were my kids, I'd be in the back row shedding a tear right now. So congratulations and thanks for being a part of today. We appreciate it. Can we give them a round of applause? Thank you.
Tasmania has welcomed its first Bush Summit, where the government continues to push for a better regional landscape. The big focus has been on the state's unique agriculture sector, including a high-quality food and wine industry. Primary Industries Minister Joe Palmer and Opposition Leader Rebecca White both spoke along these lines, as well as a need for improved healthcare services and digital infrastructure in rural and remote areas.
There's often a deflection to the federal government for primary health responsibilities, but when it comes to how we might use our regional hospitals, we think we could put nurse practitioners in there, rural generalists, provide a multidisciplinary team, which would mean that our doctors, like Dr. Latt in that instance, is well supported and the community can continue to access healthcare, and that if we just prevent 3 people presenting to the emergency department every day because they can instead access primary care closer to home, it effectively pays for itself. It's a win-win. Just this week, my child was very sick and an ambulance was called. We live out in Sorrel Way and the local ambulance at Sorrel was at Signet. So often you're seeing resources deployed to other parts of the state because they're under enormous pressure, because they're then getting ramped at the hospital, which means that you don't have a local ambulance in your own community, which was our experience. So we had an ambulance come from Bridgewater to Sorrel in our situation. Everything's fine.
I was going to say that.
Everything's all right, and the care we got was amazing, but the pressure on local ambulance services is enormous, and a lot of the time they get ramped at a hospital, which means they're in the city and they're absent from their local community. So what we need to be able to do is employ more paramedics for a start. The government's own work tells us we'll need another 126 ambulance paramedics by 25-26. We have a plan to, in the first instance, upgrade 6 of our ambulance stations, so Smithton, Bridport, Queenstown, Oatlands, Swansea and Newbena, so that they can have permanent paramedics stationed there, because at the moment they rely very much on volunteers, and that's a huge responsibility for those locals in the community who are volunteering. But often they tell me that when they do that, they end up at the city ramped, and then they might be deployed, to Signet, out of area if they're volunteering in Oatlands, and that's not why they sign up to help their local community. Yeah. So we'd be employing more paramedics to support them to stay local and to support their regional communities, because an emergency needs an emergency response. You can't be waiting minutes or hours, and unfortunately we've seen those response times blow out.
One of the biggest issues we have is GPs in our regional and rural areas. In fact, GPs in our cities as well, to be honest. But, if you're living in one of those remoter parts of Tasmania and there's only one GP and they go on holidays, that's a stressful time for that community. And we also know that, the responsibility of GPs rests with the federal government. But our government, has really done everything we can to work with the federal government, to work in partnership with them. It's very easy to say, oh, that's a local government problem, that's a state government problem, that's a federal government problem. But when it's a problem for Tasmania, it's a problem for all levels of government, and we have to come together. And that's what, we've certainly tried to do in this space. And we, of course, have our pilot program with our GPs, incentivising them to have their training in our regional and rural areas. And that's a great partnership that we have with the federal government, and so we're really excited to see the outcomes of that.
Tasmania is probably the most decentralised state in Australia, and people love living in regional towns. Tasmanians love living in regional towns. Those that come to settle here in Tasmania love their regional towns, and to be able to do that you need good infrastructure, be that road infrastructure or telecommunications infrastructure, and we need to see that investment there. and the Albanese government is delivering on that investment.
This is a responsibility for government as well, thinking about how we improve our digital infrastructure, which I know is a big barrier for lots of businesses who are currently trading in Tasmania because they don't know sometimes whether or not their internet's going to be reliable enough to make a transaction. And then you've got the impacts on households and children's learning and just the way that we use our phones and our devices these days. You need to be connected. Just making a call going up the Midland Highway, you know where all the black spots are and you know where you're going to have to hang up and call someone back. It'd be great if we didn't have to work like that and live like that and we had better digital infrastructure. And I think there's a real opportunity to work collaboratively with local and federal and state governments and with the telcos to look at how we deal with some of those black spot issues, because it has an impact on our emergency services, it has an impact on our businesses and on communities and children's education.
Here at the Bush Summit in Wodonga, we've heard from business owners, community leaders and key political figures who have discussed some of the big issues affecting regional and rural Victoria. Some of the main points of discussion have included housing, healthcare and also the state of regional Victoria's roads. Here's just some of what was discussed.
My community was also significantly flood affected by the October floods, which just smashed through great swathes of particularly around central and northern Victoria. We do have a lot of work to do in terms of repairing those flood affected roads, and part of the challenge too is the potholes keep opening up as the weather dries out. Then you have another downfall, the potholes keep opening up. So that's why there is a lot of investment that we've made to date. There hasn't been funding cuts. There's been investment. We made an immediate injection of $165 million to go out there and quickly fix as many potholes as we could.
I heard that the Minister, Allan, stood up and said there hadn't been any cuts to road funding. Well, that's not my experience when I look at the Victorian budget. It's not my experience when I look at the federal budget. The duplication of the Western Highway, cut in the October federal budget. Locally here we've had projects, the Shepparton Bypass, which was going to be really catalytic for that regional community, particularly as it's such a huge transport hub. That's been cut by the federal government.
But I did want to pick up, Nick, on your observation around how housing is an economic constraint as well. It is absolutely, and we have to continue to invest more in public and social affordable housing, and that's what we're doing through our big build, through our regional housing fund, which again I mentioned earlier. But it is also an economic constraint as well. And I know of I know of a business in the western part of Victoria who's bought the local pub so that they can have somewhere where their workers can stay, because being able to have a workforce to find a place to live in the town close to the business, they couldn't find anything because it was a supply issue. It's both a supply issue and affordability issue. Talk to any of the communities in tourism areas, whether it's here in the high country or down on the coast.
All the Prime Minister has done after coming out of National Cabinet is add another 200,000 houses to an already unattainable million houses. I mean, we've had the housing industry come out and say we've got new starts at the lowest level since Gillard was Prime Minister, and there is no way we can get 1 million houses built in this time frame. So it's a great headline. He can stand there with his Labor premiers and they can all nod and shake hands. I have, unfortunately, little hope that those houses will get built. And it doesn't matter whether it's here in Wodonga, whether it's in Witchyproo, Echuca, wherever I go across regional Victoria. The housing crisis isn't just in Melbourne.
Unique challenges have been highlighted at the Queensland Bush Summit in Rockhampton, where dozens of key leaders and policymakers have gathered. The Queensland Premier used her speech to inject $80 million into the regions and announce a mental health facility in Rockhampton. Here's more.
I can announce a $30 million Backing the Bush Communities Fund. This includes $8 million for workforce training in partnership with the Queensland Farmers Federation and AgForce, with a focus on essential and emerging skills for agriculture. It also includes a $10 million for community projects like parks, music trails, festivals. It's an opportunity for councils to partner with businesses or companies for these small grants. Today, I announced that we will not just refurbish the Rockhampton's mental health unit, we will replace it. This new $91.9 million 31-bed facility will be brand new and state-of-the-art. This is a big issue, not just across rural and remote areas and regional areas, but across all of Queensland. Mental health is a very, very big issue.
I have to say I've loved getting out and touring regional Queensland to see all of our hospitals and really to meet the dedicated staff, the doctors, the nurses, the midwives who work in our regional hospitals. They do amazing work every day. And of course, there are real challenges. And I think the biggest challenge right now is workforce. And that's a global problem. Health workforce shortages are a real problem. And it is why, unfortunately, we did see Gladstone, women in Gladstone, unable to have their babies. And I wanted to go there straight away and hear from those women and do everything we could to get birthing happen in communities, because we want everyone in regional Queensland to be able to have access to quality healthcare close to home.
If you want to convince people to stay in a regional area and move into a regional area, you've got to be able to deliver those services. They need to be able to count on that. So if you want to attract a young family or keep a young family, they need to know when it's time to have a baby that they can have it in those areas that they call home. And when I look and see the closure of maternity services over many, many decades, with the advent and the improvement of modern medicine, the fact that women can't have babies in places where they have for generations, I'm just not comfortable with that. And we saw a city the size of Gladstone for the better part of a year to not have maternity services. That's just fundamentally wrong. And so you've got to deliver those services, and people need to be able to count on world-class services no matter where they live. Interestingly, it's always regional Queensland that is the canary in the coal mine and feels things first. And the three big issues, without a shadow of a doubt, is health, housing and law and order. And I'd be doing a massive disservice if I sat up here today and didn't raise that, particularly law and order. It was Townsville, that was the first community when the laws were watered down 8 years ago, that said, we are going to have a problem here. And they were right. On the back of weaker laws, you've had 8 years of a generation of untouchables. And whilst I'll continue to point out the problem, we've also put forward solutions, and my solution is the Youth Justice Act has to be rewritten. We have to start again. You have to remove the provision that says detention has to be a last resort. You've got to unshackle the judiciary to do that, and we've got to get serious about early intervention. That is a key.
The Queensland economy is going through a big transition, and we are a resource-rich state. Coal is going to have still a significant role to play. In terms of our metallurgical coal, there is no alternative to making steel. And what we've done is we've actually assured our trading partners that we are committed to ensuring that they have security of supply. However, what we also know is that we are on the cusp of the biggest renewable energy revolution that our state and our country has ever seen. The big mining companies, the big companies in South Korea and Japan, they now have two arms. So when they come to meet me, they say, we are from our coal division, and the next person says, we are from our renewable energy division. So the whole world is moving in this place.
We've gone from basically no solar or wind a decade ago to now about a quarter of our electricity comes from solar and wind. We've been installing solar and wind power at a rate 4 times per person than in the US or North America. And I think it's about time we have to admit that the proof is in the pudding. That whatever models or calculations in a spreadsheet you are doing, we have massively moved to solar and wind energy, shut down coal-fired power stations, not invested in gas, kept our ban on nuclear energy, and our power bills have gone through the roof. It's costing Australians dearly. And it's also putting at risk a lot of our jobs here in central Queensland in the industrial sector. So we might not have much more time, but I think it's time to realise that we're going the wrong way and we've got to turn around. We should make our decisions in Canberra based on what we principally think is in the national interest, not in our narrow political interests.
Well, it's been great to have this Bush Summit, especially to hear from those in the bush. I hope the pollies listen and their advisors to this much common sense and wisdom and the concerns that have been shared. I mean, we're talking decades to get through government approvals now for significant mines. You know, we've just got to bring some reality into this emotional discussion. In short, net zero targets are being forced upon industry, but government is standing in the way of timely developing the rare earths and critical minerals that are required. Australia must focus on increasing investment and productivity to even maintain its standard of living. Special economic zones with reduced taxation and much reduced TAPE are the catalyst to achieve these objectives. By focusing on these, we can welcome investment, transform regions, amplify growth, and bring life to the Bush Summit's admirable theme, quote, improving the lives of regional Australians to create a better Australia, end quote. Love that quote. Our aspirations for Rockhampton and for all Queensland and Australia are commendable. I like very much the spirit of the Bush Summit theme, which I've just quoted. Now we just need the government to embrace this too and provide the tape cuts needed to make it a reality. I extend my heartfelt thanks to News Corp for organising this Bush Summit and to each one of you. It is our joint spirit, our relentless persistence, the grit that enables a flourishing future. Here's to ensuring that our whole voice reverberates effectively across Australia. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this year's Bush Summit special presentation. And as you've just seen, the issues facing regional Australia are not small, so how great is it bringing together community leaders, policymakers, farmers and entrepreneurs who've all shared their insights and ideas in how we can create meaningful change across regional Australia. Again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next year for Bush Summit 2024.